Ladies and gentlemen, whatever you may think about David Irving, and this was, and of course, all of us here love him. No, whatever you think about David Irving, even his enemies concede that his knowledge of Hitler and the Third Reich is without parallel. David Irving has devoted more time, more effort to doing more digging in more archives of original sources about Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich and the larger World War II era than any other single living historian. This is acknowledged even by the judge in the infamous Lipstadt case. It's acknowledged even by people who don't like his views on any number of subjects. It's a rare, great privilege and honor to introduce David Irving to this meeting tonight and at other IHR meetings. We're very glad to have him back again tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. David Irving.
Thank you, Mark. I've had to rewrite most of my talk for this evening because Mark has said virtually everything I was going to say, and he's beating a retreat. Winston Churchill once said, in fact, the world is full of the most damnable lies about me. And I can empathize with Churchill. The world is full of the most damnable lies about me, said Winston Churchill, and the damnable thing is that most of them are true. And I feel the same way myself sometimes. Wicked, wicked, wicked things are said about me around the world. And people, thanks to the wonders of the internet, are constantly sending me these wicked things that people are saying about me, really making my day again and again. When every morning, every day I get about 300 to 400 emails. And it takes three hours off my morning answering email. So those of you who have email, please bear in mind that you may get a very grumpy reply from me. You may even get a one-line reply, but I do answer every email I get. One of the emails I received 2 or 3 days ago contained a BBC program or article about written by a man called Raffi Berg, who I assume comes from the same country as Raffi Eitan, the man who captured Adolf Eichmann. Raffi Berg has written an article about the deniers, the Holocaust deniers. This is this kind of Goebbelsian word they use to describe anybody who doesn't conform with the present view of the history of the Third Reich. He is a Holocaust denier. Anybody who is entitled to large sums of money is a Holocaust survivor. A Holocaust survivor actually is defined by the Simon Wiesenthal Center here in your own hometown, California. Anybody who lived in the confines of the Third Reich, Hitler's Reich, and French North Africa during the period of the Third Reich, in other words, 1933 to 1945, is a Holocaust survivor. But some restrictions apply. You have to be of the Jewish faith. Then you are a Holocaust survivor. You don't have to have been in a camp. You don't have to suffer any indignities, any kind of torture or deprivations. You're a Holocaust survivor if you were of the Jewish faith and lived in the frontiers of the Third Reich and French North Africa. And then you're entitled to cash handouts from this huge fund they built up from this two-word Holocaust survivor has immense power, as has the word, of course, Holocaust denier, in a negative sense. Anybody who's a Holocaust denier isn't going to eat lunch in this town again. Anybody who's a Holocaust survivor is going to eat lunch, and very well indeed. And to my mind, a Holocaust survivor basically is somebody to whom not very much happened during World War II. If you think about it, Hadassah Lieberman, the wife of Senator Lieberman, she boasts in the newspapers of being a daughter of a Holocaust survivor. So they're already preparing the next generation of goodies. A daughter of a Holocaust survivor, Hadassah Lieberman, daughter of a Holocaust survivor means daughter of somebody to whom not very much happened during World War II. If it had been daughter of a Dresden survivor, or daughter of a Hiroshima survivor, or daughter of a Guernica or Coventry survivor, then I might begin to prick up my ears a bit. People went through World War II and suffered. And I remember going through World War II. I can reveal here the secret of the fact that I was born in March 1938, which meant that I went through World War II. I'm a Holocaust survivor in that sense, I suppose. I ended the war at the age of 6 or 7, I suppose, 1945, which is roughly the same age as Abraham Foxman, who claims to be a Holocaust survivor because he was looked after by a Catholic family in Poland throughout the war, and he is a Holocaust survivor. My own deprivations during World War II were the kind of deprivations that meant something. to me as a child. The war didn't mean anything to me. I wasn't frightened at all. The bombs came, the bombs fell, the rockets fell, whiz, bang, they were very spectacular. The whole ground shook. Our house gradually collected cracks in the ceilings and walls. I remember looking out of our bathroom window one day as a flying bomb went past about 200 or 300 feet above the ground. Flying bomb is what you would nowadays call a cruise missile, a pilotless bomb with 2 tons of high explosive in its warhead and a streak of jet flame coming out of the pulse jet in the back, the ramjet engine, the Argus tube as it was called. And it would arrive on the horizon with a deafening organ-like note, the deepest double diapason note an organ produce. I can't hear it on the radio or BBC now on the old gramophone records of the time without a shudder going down my spine, because it now begins to frighten me, the sound. But during the war, I was just very interested in this thing flying past. And then it would suddenly cut out. The flame would cut out, the sound would go, 25 seconds of silence, and then bang. And our mother, myself, my 3 siblings, we slept under a steel table, a Morrison table it was called. It was a Morrison steel shelter, which is a 6-foot by 8-foot steel plank of half-inch thick steel on L girders, made into a box, and we would sleep under that. It was kind of, it had steel springs underneath so you could sleep on it, and we 4 children slept under that, and our mother must have been mortally terrified of what would happen to the family, but we weren't. What upset me was the fact that this man, Adolf Hitler, was depriving me of toys. You see, we didn't have toys. It's maybe difficult for you Americans to appreciate what it is like to be brought up as a child and have no toys. On our garage floor, I found a catalogue of Gamage's, the big toy shop in London, which no longer exists. It went out of business 20 or 30 years ago, but Gamage's was the toy shop. And there was a catalogue. And I would sit cross-legged on the floor as a 4 or 5-year-old child, looking at the catalogue and saying to myself, so this is what toys are. Engines, toy train sets. Who of us hasn't wanted to have a toy train set? I still haven't had a toy train set. I've had 5 daughters, one after the other. I have no excuse. At least if I had had 5 American daughters, I could have bought Lionel train sets, because the Lionel company, of course, made a famous train set called the Pink Lionel for girls. It didn't do well. Girls don't appreciate toy train sets. I appreciated it was in my genes, it was in my microchip. There's something in our microchip, you see. Just like in the female microchip, there's this embedded phrase where they say to men when they grow up, if you don't know what you've done to upset me, I'm not going to tell you. Remember that? There isn't a man who hasn't had that said to him at some time in their microchip. I'm sorry. Go away. Okay, dealt with that. Every chef has a syndrome. And now microchip is liking locomotives, liking toy trains. So I had the Gamage's catalogue, and Adolf Hitler had personally deprived me of having toy trains, or toys. In fact, we were very deprived when the end of the war came. We were so deprived, we had no food, of course, in England. It was very badly looked after. We had no cream. I remember we had ration books. We used to go to our local grocer. I would go to the grocer, Mr. Williams, who probably was too old to fight in the war or something like that, a kind of mousy, rabbity kind of man, and he would thump the sugar in the brown paper bags on the table and tie it up with string, and he would cut the coupons out of the coupon book, the ration book, like postage stamps they were. He would cut them out of the ration book with L-shaped scissors, because you had to cut out one coupon. I've never seen L-shaped scissors before or since. They must have been very rare. They wore a string around his neck, and he would cut out the coupons and you didn't get enough sugar, you didn't get enough meat, we were deprived. In 1947, my mother took us to the Isle of Wight, which is an island off the south coast of England, and she looked at me and my twin brother, age 7, and she said, you 2 children, because our ribs were showing through our skin, the rib cage, you could see the ribs. My mother said, you 2 look like Belsen children, to me and my twin brother. You look like Belsen children. And I didn't know what a Belsen child was. Now, of course, I know, the whole world knows, because it's part of the propaganda against the Germans, the Belsen children, the Belsen victims. The Nazi concentration camp, the first one overrun by the British Army in near Hanover, Bergen-Belsen camp, where they found mounds of bodies, emaciated bodies, and you've seen the photographs. My own little girl, 11 years old now, comes back from a school outing to the Imperial War Museum last term, except the Imperial War Museum, which used to be just a museum to the exploits and heroism of the British armies establishing the British Empire around the world. Now it's got a Holocaust wing attached. What has that got to do with Britain or the British Empire? It's got a Holocaust memorial wing attached where school children are taken and are shown photographs of Belsen. She brought back a copy of a photograph of Belsen. showing a bulldozer pushing bodies into a pit. And I said, Jessica, have a look at that photograph again. It's a British soldier driving a British Army bulldozer. It's after the war, and they're pushing the bodies into a pit for reasons of hygiene. These are typhus victims. The bodies are all emaciated and hideously malformed because of the diseases that have been inflicted on them in the last weeks of the war. And who was responsible for the malnutrition and the diseases in Bergen-Belsen? Might it perhaps have been the people who carried out the saturation bombing of the pharmaceutical factories and the transportation networks, namely the British Air Force and the Americans? Are we not at least equally guilty and to blame for the malnutrition and the horrors that we found when we entered the camp? The whole of Germany was starving at that time. It wasn't just the people in Belsen who were the Belsen children with the rib cages showing. It was the whole of Germany was suffering because of the bombing campaign, which was deliberately designed to destroy the transportation network, and so the food supplies collapsed. Jessica's clever now. She said, well, yes, I guess. I said, if that, of course, had been a German soldier driving a Nazi bulldozer, then we'd never see enough of those photographs. Nazi bulldozers pushing bodies into pits. But that's the way that propaganda works. But even during the war, I was beginning to wonder who this man Hitler that we heard so much about was. We had a magazine called Everybody's, which rather like Life magazine, photogravure, kind of sepia brownish photographs, very well reproduced photographs. It came out every week. It was Everybody's weekly magazine, largely pictorial, but it also had a page or half a page of caricatures called Arthur Ferrier's World Searchlight. Arthur Ferrier was a brilliant cartoonist, caricaturist, and every week it was peopled by the same odd freaks. I suppose nowadays you'd see Condoleezza Rice and people like that in with their kind of cast iron hairstyles, but in those days it was the little humpbacked, club-footed Dr. Goebbels and the big, fat, gigantic Hermann Goering and Adolf Hitler with his postman's hat and crinkly boots and little postman's moustache. And these were the people who apparently were depriving me of toys, and I wanted to know more about who they were, but I didn't tell anybody yet. Kept it to myself, because children are like that. Children very early on begin veering away from the freeway that their parents want them to drive down. And I wanted to know more, but I didn't tell anyone. And when I went to school, very old English school. If I say very old, I mean, in the United States, very old is like 80 or 90 years. My school was founded in 1432, I think. Outside our classroom window, even in the classroom when I was learning Latin in the old days, there was a tree stump, a charred tree stump, surrounded by iron railings, because it was a historic relic. It was a stump of a tree where a Catholic martyr had been burnt to the stake. Not burnt like a stake, but burnt at the stake. And there was, eventually Brentwood City Council had this tree stump bulldozed away, I suppose because it was a hygiene hazard or a traffic hazard. They had no kind of romance in them, but in my days, you could look out the window and see what we used to do to the Catholics. And there was this tree stump there as a lesson to the other Catholics to mind their tongues in future. Otherwise, they're going to end. So, but at this school, we had a liberal headmaster who encouraged us to think freely. Nobody was sent to prison for thinking the wrong things, the way you are in Germany nowadays. In one of the cases, Günter Deckert, he was sent to prison because he presided over a meeting that I'd spoken at in Germany. And although I hadn't actually spoken the sentence complained of in the police reports, as the tape recording showed, the judge found that Mr. Deckert knew that I was the kind of person who might have said that, even though I didn't. And he served 7 years in jail in Germany. It was only released 2 or 3 years ago. Günter Deckert, remember that name. He's one of the martyrs of this very interesting fight against what I call the conformist historians. So all the way through school, I wanted to know more about this man, Adolf Hitler. I think I actually wrote 1 or 2 articles about him at school, kind of childish things on my mother's ancient typewriter. It was an ancient Remington typewriter, so old that you had to lift up the carriage to see what you had typed. The typing was underneath. The keys came up from underneath and hammered at the plate and from underneath. I mean, all of you now have your laptops, but this is how we used to write in the old days. And I oiled this typewriter, my mother's, and got it working and began writing on it. And that's how I became a writer, in fact. And when I published my first book, The Destruction of Dresden, which I wrote when I was 21, and it was complete when I was 23, and it was published when I was 25 in 1963, and became a worldwide bestseller. And my publisher, William Kimber, who was a gentleman publisher. A gentleman publisher is a publisher who doesn't tell his authors that they're entitled to advances. So he was a gentleman publisher, and I wrote this for him, and I waited to get some money from him, and while we were waiting to get the money, the book was a worldwide bestseller, The Destruction of Dresden. After it had been published, he said, "What are you going to write next?" And I said, "I want to write a book about Adolf Hitler, using the same methods." I want to find out who this person really was, using the same techniques. Just the same as I wrote the Dresden book. I found the airmen who'd taken part in the raids, the British and American, advertised in newspapers. I found the people who'd been on the ground who had suffered the Dresden bombing Holocaust, as we're now entitled to call it in Germany. The judge had just ruled that it's not a criminal offense to call Dresden a Holocaust 3 or 4 days ago. And he said, go for it. And I thought it would take about 5 years. In fact, it took about 10 years, and then another 10 years revising it, another 10 or 15 years revising it after that. So it's been the kind of flagship of my writing career, writing the biography of Adolf Hitler. But I had the advantage that I was the Englishman who had written the book about Dresden. So when I went to see Adolf Hitler's staff, as they were all still alive at that time, they were willing to speak to me. The first man who spoke to me was Otto Günscher, who died last year. He was the man who burned Hitler's body. You'll see him in this new film, The Downfall, but totally wrongly displayed. Otto Günscher was a big, blonde, burly man, an SS officer, SS colonel. In the film he's portrayed differently, but everything they say about him there is correct. He was the one who was told to go and find the 200 litres of gasoline, as he told me. I was the first person, in fact, the only person he spoke to and gave an interview. Hitler said to him, I'm going to commit suicide at 3 o'clock this afternoon, and Eva Braun also will be leaving this life, and it is your job to come into the room 10 minutes after you hear the shots fired and make sure that we're dead. And if I'm not dead or she's not dead, then I command you to finish us off. And then you are to carry us up into the garden and cremate us so that the Russians find nothing. He told me this in great detail. One of these days I'll produce a disc for you. You can listen to the actual tape recording I've got of my interview with Otto Günscher. And he trusted me because I was the Englishman who had written the book about Dresden. And eventually he turned the key for me in the doors of, well, the Adolf Hitler inner circle. And I spoke to most of Adolf Hitler's private staff, who were still alive in those days, the 1960s, the 1970s. There's only 1 or 2 still left now, alive in their late 90s. In fact, I suppose there's no room in this, there's no hand in this room which has shaken more hands and shook Adolf Hitler's hand than this hand here. So you better watch when you come up and shake my hand. You have to remember whose hand, you have to remember where it's been, so to speak. But this is one reason why the other historians, the conformist historians, don't like me, because they never got through that never got through to that inner ring. They just relied on second-hand sources or third-hand sources, which you can get away with. I mean, I don't mind popular books. They can write popular books that are going to appear in Barnes & Noble based entirely on other people's books. After a time, it has a certain incestuous quality. I think I actually say in Hitler's War that these German historians have committed one act of incest after another. On the question of what Adolf Hitler knew about the Holocaust, for example. A very interesting question. What did Hitler know about Auschwitz? They were well, of course he knew. He was the one who gave the order. And I said, yes, but what's the evidence? And Hillgruber, who I'm interviewing, Professor Hillgruber, says, well, I had it from Professor Jekyll. Professor Jekyll says, but I had it from Professor Jacobson. And Professor Jacobson said, yes, but I had it from Professor Brochard. And I asked Professor Brochard, and he said, I had it from Hillgruber. So the circle is complete. They've all been quoting each other like dogs running around in a circle, sniffing each other's tails. And of course, it has no basis on hard fact at all. It's just like the Goodyear blimp I saw floating around this afternoon here. It's got no contact with the ground. It's just got the one word written on the side, Hitler gave the order. 2 words, 3 words. Hitler gave the order. And they've got no evidence for it at all. And of course, when I said, well, okay, let's see the actual evidence. Let's see the documents. Here's $1,000 if you can find one single wartime contemporary document showing Hitler even knew what was going on. Surely that should be simple. That's one where you don't have to kind of infer something or agree that this was a euphemism or something like that. Let's see one explicit German document and I'll give you $1,000. I've said that, in fact, £1,000, which is, as you know, about $2,000 now. I said that ever since 1977. And they've all gone around indignant and red-faced with humiliation, saying, and a historian only a few days ago said on television, he said that the world's historians are ashamed of David Irving. And so they should be ashamed, frankly. So they should be ashamed. What they have been doing for 50 years since the end of World War II is shameful. They've all been quoting each other and not going back to primary sources. They sit in their book-lined caves, plucking a book off a shelf, and books are handy. They've got indexes, they're printed, they don't have to read nasty, smudgy handwriting. If they're lucky, they've got nice pictures in too, some of them in color. But it's not research. You just copy one book, that's called plagiarism. Copy 2 books, that's research. Copy 3 or 4 books, that's in-depth, profound research, and so it goes on. Some of these historians have used as many as 10 books in writing the 11th book. But it doesn't actually advance the cause of human knowledge or science. You can get away with it, of course, for a popular book, but it depends which books you take. And Mark, of course, has drawn your attention to some of the books, which are the book by Rauschning, for example, My Conversations with Hitler, as Mark says quite rightly, has been exposed by serious objective historians as being a total fake. Published in Britain in about 1940 by the Propaganda Publishing House, the same one who published Fritz Thiesen's memoirs. He had the same agent, Imre Reeves. His real name is Imre Reves. He was a Hungarian Jew who was the literary agent. All of them had the same guy. And the books were published in the same English publishing house in 1940 when, of course, paper couldn't be obtained for proper books, but for propaganda books you can get them. And Rauschning's book wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. I've seen in the records, in the archives of the German Foreign Ministry, the files showing the frantic attempts made by the top Nazis to find out how often Rauschning actually was with Hitler. And they came up with Goering ordered an investigation into this, Hermann Goering. And the conclusion was that Rauschning had been with Hitler only once or twice at most at diplomatic receptions, the same annual diplomatic reception every January, where Hitler met all the diplomats and shook hands and said a few words to them, and how's your dog, and how's your wife, and he'd been briefed on what to say to the diplomats in the way that statesmen are. And everybody said, gosh, he knew all about my dog and my wife and everything. But in fact, he'd only been briefed about it the day before. And this is how far Rauschning got. And yet his book is now, as Mark said, widely quoted. It's not the only one. I can give a number of other examples of that. Another book, which is a favorite, is the memoirs of Count Ciano, Galeazzo Ciano, the Italian foreign minister, until Italy's defection in 1943. He wrote a very famous diary. You'll find it quoted in every popular work of history, because it's full of, well, what we would now call lurid sound bites, the kind of things that historians like. Ribbentrop was, and then comes some two-line lurid sentence about Joachim Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister. And that's why the historians like it. It's all served up there. They look in the index, Ribbentrop, what can I say about Ribbentrop? Turn to page 347, Ribbentrop was this, that, and the other. Excellent quote, put it in my book too. And that way, as the Germans say, lies have long legs. And these fantasies never get dispelled. But what about the Ciano diary? How genuine is it? He did write a diary, we know that. But what has been published is not what he wrote. His diary was taken over by the American OSS and worked over, and the lurid stuff was injected into it. We know this from the statements of the SS officers who were collaborating with the OSS at that time. Eugen Dollmann is one. We know this, that Alan Dulles had a hand in it. Alan Dulles, who was the chief of the OSS in Bern, in Switzerland, and who later became the first director of the CIA. His files, his private papers, are now in the Sealy Mudd Library, manuscript library of Princeton University. And I went to have a look at them. You can't have a look at them. You can look at the catalogue of them. The Alan Dulles papers are closed, probably in perpetuity, and I don't know of any historian. It's the only collection of papers I've been refused access to in my life, oddly enough. And I'm very hurt by this, and I contacted the foundation who runs the Sealy Mudd Library at Princeton, and the answer came back, well, it's not just you, Mr. Irving. Every historian has been denied access to the Alan Dulles papers so far. But you can read the index to them, and there are 26 files on the forging of the Ciano diaries. But historians should see that they're forged from the content. December 1940, Count Ciano writes in one entry in his diary that the mess we're in Italy now is thanks to General Erwin Rommel. If it wasn't for Rommel, we wouldn't be in this mess we're in North Africa now. Rommel wasn't sent to North Africa until 2 months later, February 1941. So that diary entry is the first piece of evidence that that's a fake. But people still quote the Ciano diaries because it is so useful to quote. And this is basically one of the fundamental lessons that you learn as a non-conformist historian, that in wartime, and I'm not criticizing this, governments create propaganda agencies whose job it is to lie about the enemy. Propaganda agencies. In England, it's called the Ministry of Information. In the United States, it was the Office of War Information. In Germany, it was the Reich Propaganda Ministry. And these bodies continue spewing out the lies about the enemy so that the soldiers point their guns in the right direction, whether it's Iran or Saddam Hussein or Iraq or whatever. That's the job of the propaganda ministries, and I'm not criticizing it. In wartime, you do that kind of thing. But when the war ends, the problem is there's no Ministry of Truth. There's no body set up by the same government to kind of follow the parade like the man with the bucket and the shovel picking up the dirt. It should be the job of the historians, but of course they don't do that, because if you do that, you're going to get shot at. Because they've learned, probably by then, the respectable historians, the conformist historians, that it's better just to swim with the tide. Keep your head below the parapet. They've been taught by professors who were taught by professors who were taught by professors who were professors during the war. So it's a kind of self-propagating thing, and they've all got their blinkers on, and nobody's actually thinking sideways. And thinking sideways is what we, the nonconformists, do. We'd not been given a set list of reading books, usually containing quite a large number of books written by Herr Professor himself. We're capable of thinking for ourselves and going back to the original records and saying this doesn't ring true, and supposing the real explanation. For example, January the 19th, I think it was, 1945, Adolf Hitler, in his war conference, is informed by the Chief of the Army General Staff, Guderian, that Auschwitz has been captured by the Red Army. We know this because there was a stenographer present. He wrote down everything Hitler said in shorthand. There were 12 stenographers who had worked in relays, writing down all his war conferences from September 1942 onwards. We have fragments of those transcripts still. Here's the one fragment, the interesting one. Quite interesting. Guderian says, "Mein Führer, yesterday the Red Army overran Auschwitz." What does Hitler say? Jawohl. Yes. Moving on. But, I mean, surely if Hitler had known what was happening at Auschwitz, according to the present version of the Holocaust, he would have said something, even perhaps in a euphemistic form, saying, well, I hope you managed to clear things up first, or something like that. But no, it's just, yes, Auschwitz doesn't really mean anything to him at all when he hears about it. At lower levels, it may have done. But to him and I suppose to the German Army General Staff, Auschwitz was famous only as being the center of their biggest final synthetic rubber plant that was left. And that's gone too. So things are coming to an end. But that's what the original records show. But of course, now we know that Adolf Hitler was to blame for everything, including the gas chambers at Auschwitz. Gas chambers? Well, we nonconformists are still skeptical about that, about the number, the existence, the scale, whatever it was happening there, because the conformists have not done a very good job in convincing us. A few days ago, the BBC, as I mentioned earlier, ran this program by Rafi Berg, which is on the BBC website now, and I've posted it on my website because it's so glorious, so wonderful. Rafi Berg says, fortunately, the deniers are not making much headway. Unfortunately, the eyewitnesses of that era are dying out. And everything depends on the eyewitnesses because there are no documents. The great turning point was when David Irving was defeated in the action he brought against Deborah Lipstadt in the year 2000. He was the most dangerous of the deniers. Well, there's something already not quite right here, because either the deniers are a danger or they're not. And either there's evidence or there isn't. And if the eyewitnesses is dying out, then probably the deniers should be dying out at the same rate too, except, of course, they depend on the eyewitnesses for the whole of their story. Martin Gilbert, most unfortunately, he's the British famous historian, I suppose he's now the leading British historian, Sir Martin Gilbert, a Jewish historian. And Martin Gilbert said, the eyewitnesses are in an incredible state. He referred to the incredible state of the eyewitnesses of Auschwitz and the Holocaust. Rather unfortunate to use the word incredible when it comes to eyewitnesses. In other words, you can't believe them, the incredible eyewitnesses. But that's the word that Martin Gilbert unfortunately uses. And right at the end of the BBC broadcast on Auschwitz, which was about 3 or 4 months ago, on the anniversary of the Auschwitz 60th anniversary of its liberation, they broadcast a 4-part film documentary produced by Lawrence Rees on Auschwitz. It was broadcast on PBS in the United States as well. Some of you may have seen it. And the very closing episode of that closes with the words of an SS guard at Auschwitz called Gröning, who has finally decided to come clean, he says, because he can no longer live with what he knows. And then he says, according to the BBC's English version, I saw it all with my own eyes. I saw the gas chambers. I saw the burning pits. I saw the crematoria, the open fires. Somebody has written to me from Portugal 2 or 3 days ago, and I put this on my website. He says, I have the transcript. I have the recording of the BBC film, part 4, containing that. And you can hear Gröning's words in German underneath the English transcript, the subtitles. And Gröning actually says, I feel I have to say what I've seen. I saw the crematoria. I saw the pits. I saw the bodies. Spot the difference. He doesn't say, I saw the gas chambers, but that's been put into it by the BBC. And these are how the lies are created and are generated and maintained. They haven't got one eyewitness who is credible. And I pointed this out in the Lipstadt trial. I said to their expert, Van Pelt, who I think is a very good expert on Auschwitz, but unfortunately totally bought over by the other side. In the Lipstadt trial, he was paid $250,000 to give evidence against me. Imagine that. What kind of evidence is going to be objective when you're paid that kind of money? But I asked him, I said towards the end of his cross-examination, when I was cross-examining him, I said, Professor Van Pelt, how many people survived Auschwitz? And he said, oh, I don't know. And I said, well, was it 1 or 100 or 1,000 or 10,000? Or he said, well, about 10,000. So I say, well, 10,000 survived Auschwitz, in other words. He doesn't know which way my question is going. So he says, well, the exact figure was 7,200 and something. So he did know, but he didn't want to admit that he knew the figure because he still doesn't know. So I said, well, 7,200 survived, but all you've quoted here in court are 7 eyewitnesses who were Auschwitz survivors, you say. Ada Bimco, Tauber, Dragan, and so on. Why don't we ever hear from the other 7,193? Why is it always these same 7 witnesses who were paid to give evidence or induced to give evidence in the war crimes trials at the end of the war by the British and American courts they gave evidence in? Why don't we hear from the other 7,300? I'd like to hear from them. I'd find it very interesting just to sit down with a dozen of them, perhaps, one afternoon and have a chat around the tape recorder and hear and question them objectively as what exactly they saw. But the conformists don't do that because that's not the way they write history. They will read the books. Another book that they use is Felix Kirsten. Felix Kirsten was a masseur who was very popular with the top Nazis because people like Ribbentrop and Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS, they had serious stomach pains. I'm sure a doctor could probably explain, or a psychiatrist, why they had these. They were probably psychosomatic. I don't know. But anyway, they believed they had these terrible stomach pangs, these spasms, and this masseur, Felix Kirsten, was able, with his magic fingers, to massage the pains away, or so he told them, and he was very well paid. He rose to the height of his profession in Germany. And he began writing a diary on what they told him, what Himmler and Ribbentrop and the rest said. And the Kirsten diaries do exist because Hugh Trevor-Roper, who was a British historian, a friend of mine many years ago, he told me that he'd seen them in the Kirsten family home in Sweden. It's not what's been published, though, under the title The Kirsten Memoirs or The Kirsten Diaries. That is something different. It's been souped up. It's been, or spiked, or been salted, if you're going to talk about a gold mine. Little nuggets have been put into Kirsten diaries. There's a chapter called The Hitler Medical Dossier. Hitler Medical Dossier in the Kirsten diaries, he says Himmler one day showed him Hitler's medical dossier. Now, why Himmler, the chief of the SS and responsible for the Gestapo, is keeping a dossier on Hitler's medical condition, I don't know why, but it's believable because the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, kept dossiers or dirt files on most of the leading American personalities and people like Martin Luther King and the Beatles and John Lennon and the rest. He kept files on everybody for Franklin Roosevelt, because Roosevelt liked to know the dirt on the ministers who were sitting across the cabinet table from him, because J. Edgar Hoover's people were going to the hotel rooms and sniffing the bed sheets effectively, and Roosevelt liked to have that little edge on them. So maybe him, I would have thought it was a bit risky collecting the dirt on Adolf Hitler, even if you're Heinrich Himmler. But anyway, that's what the book says, except that it's fake. Because this medical dossier of Hitler, according to Kirsten, contains all the details of Hitler's sexually transmitted diseases, syphilis and the rest of it, which explains why he was a bit wonky on this, and his madness and the rest. I have seen, in fact, I found Hitler's medical dossier, the real one. I was sitting one afternoon in the National Archives back in about 1982 in Pennsylvania Avenue. George Wagner, the head of the German Documents Division, he was there, and we were talking. A cardboard box was on the table. It had just been brought in from the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. Somebody had brought it in saying all these documents are German. They should probably be in the National Archives rather than here in our archives in the National Institutes of Health. And after a while, I was reading something, but I kind of idly dipped my hand into the box and brought out a little pocket notebook. And I opened it, and it's a German diary in execrable handwriting, so it's probably a doctor's handwriting. And it refers to patient A. Patient A did this. Today, patient A not feeling very well. I look up 20th of July, 1944, the day of the bomb attempt on Hitler's life, and there it is, the bomb attempt on patient A. It's the diary of Dr. Morell, Hitler's personal physician, the man who was his doctor from 1937 to 22nd of April 1945, a few days before the end. I found it. I copied the entire diaries. I published them as a book called The Secret Diaries of Hitler's Doctor. In 1983 we did that. William Morrow in this country published it. Sidgwick and Jackson published it in England. But as appendices, I published also all the other documents I found, which were the urinalyses, the blood serologies, the Wassermann, the Meinecker test, and various other tests that were specific for venereal disease, sexually transmitted diseases, they're now called. Negative in Hitler's case. He was not tainted with any trace of any sexual transmitted disease, which doesn't prevent the History Channel and all the historians, the conformists, rehashing and serving it up warm all over again, the story of Hitler's sexual diseases and problems, based on the Kirsten diaries. They've not bothered to look at the real diaries written by Hitler's own physician and doctor, which contains everything, including, for example, Hitler's electrocardiograms. The first one there is dated August 1941, the first one in his dossier, the Morel dossier. An electrocardiogram, August 1941, with the diagnosis in the top right-hand corner, patient A, diagnosis, rapid progressive coronary sclerosis. It's quite amusing. The Morel diary then shows that a few weeks later, or a few days later, Hitler says to Morel, his doctor, as probably many people say to their doctors, Doctor, I can take it if you find out from your tests on me that I'm only got a short while left to live, or that there's some disease gaining control of me. You've got to tell me, because it's your duty, because I have things that I have to do, and I want to make sure I do them, that I have enough time. Morel effectively said, well, mein Führer, it's funny you should be saying that, because we've now kind of got your electrocardiograms, and they show rapid progressive coronary sclerosis. And Hitler said, what does that mean? So Morel explains it to him in layman's terms, a heart muscle defect, and says that two things can happen, either a sudden spasm, angina pectoris, or the light may go out. That's why Hitler begins speeding things up from August 1941 onwards. People say, well, he seemed like a man in a hurry. He was a man in a hurry, because I don't think he would have survived much longer after 1945 anyway. The portrayal of Hitler in the film The Downfall is very accurate in that respect. He was a man teetering towards the edge. And the diary shows it, but these are the genuine documents. And I wanted to say that when I first set out to write the book on Adolf Hitler, and I made the acquaintance of all his private staff, the four secretaries, Christian Schröder, Johanna Wolf, Gerhard Daranowski, and Traudl Junger, who died a couple of years ago. And I met also the adjutants who had served with him, and the generals, the field marshals, Sevazev. Like all Germans, even now, you find that they had two faces, or two opinions. There was the opinion they were prepared to show to strangers, and the private opinion they would reveal to you, they would disclose to you once you had won their trust. And all of these people on Adolf Hitler's private staff, they stunned me by showing great admiration for him and speaking of him only in the most glowing and positive terms. And these were educated people. They'd been to staff college, they'd been to university. They weren't just trailer trash. These were people with great insight and perception, and they'd known him for the last 10 or 12 years of his life, and they spoke well of him, even in the 1960s and 1970s. And that's what convinced me that he was worth investigating in depth, doing a real job on. In fact, I devoted, I suppose, 2/3 of my life to him. It's not an obsession. I just want to get the facts right on him. One of the things I did was to build up a huge card index on him, a chronological card index. For example, in the U.S. Navy Yard in Southeast Washington, they had the classified operational archives, which just happened to have the second carbon copy of the war diary of the German Admiralty, the German Naval Staff. 72 volumes, each volume that thick, and I sat there for 2 months reading from left to right through all 72 volumes covering the entire World War II period. And writing on a green card index, on a green index card, every single reference to Adolf Hitler, every visit made to him by the Chief of Naval Operations, every reference to a Fuhrer Naval Conference, every telegram, every telephone call from Hitler, every signal sent by Hitler to the commander of the Bismarck, or anything like that, I put it on a card index with a date and the time. And the same thing with the Air Force documents in blue, references I typed them on white cards, extracts from people's diaries, I typed on pink cards, and I eventually ended up with about 40,000 index cards over the space of the next 5 or 6 years. My wife at that time said, when are you going to start writing the book? And I said, it's taking longer than I thought, but I need a tool to get a handle on the documents in the archives, because I'm not going to use other people's books. I'm only going to use the archival documents. But eventually you ended up with something rather like an Adolf Hitler diary. That card index listed minute by minute exactly where he was, who he was with, what decisions he was taking, what he was reading, what the input was, what the output was, and so on. Unfortunately, the British government seized all my records 3 years ago. When I was on a lecture tour like this, I was up in Seattle the day the trucks rolled up outside my home, and all the parking meters were hooded to make space for the trucks, and I learned afterwards that everything had been taken away. In fact, I arrived back from the United States, back in England, with just a suit I was standing up in. They'd taken everything down to the last paperclip. And I understand that half that card index has now been accidentally destroyed. But we're fighting the British government over this, and it will come back. The reason I mention it is, just in conclusion, I'm going to mention 2 or 3 items that when you compare them with the card index, you can see that the documents are fake. One of them was the diary of Hitler's army adjutant, Gerhard Engel. He was a bright enough man. He was Hitler's army adjutant until 1943, when a muttering began, and people said, well, he's an able-bodied man. He should really be fighting at the front, whereas the rest of Hitler's staff were disabled, they had stomach problems or something. So Engel was sent to the front in 1943 and eventually rose to the rank of lieutenant general and commanded an infantry division in the final Battle of Berlin. A great man, good soldier. The trouble was he'd been on Hitler's staff. So when the war was over and the German government finally started their own army all over again, the Bundeswehr, and he wanted to apply for a job in that as a high-ranking officer, as a general again, he needed to be able to prove that, well, I mean, what militated against his getting a job was the fact that he'd been on Hitler's staff. And most applicants hadn't been on Hitler's staff, so it didn't look too good for him, unless, of course, he could prove that he'd seen through that criminal all along, even during the war years, and that he'd recognized him as the gangster and criminal and dictator that he was. And so he produced the diary, the Engel diary, which showed quite clearly that Hitler was a criminal. Except when I looked at the Engel diary, it was difficult because the people who bought it, the Institute of History in Munich, they paid a very large sum of money. I think in those days it was 50,000 Deutschmarks. Which nowadays, we're talking about back in the 1970s, they'd paid him this huge sum of money for his diaries. And they wouldn't show it to me because they claimed to be under contract, and they had Professor Krausnick, their chief historian, working on it with another historian who was preparing it for publication, doing all the kind of scientific annotations and all this kind of brow furrowing, wrinkling, serious stuff that conformist historians do. Except I was coming along from time to time and saying there's something wrong with the Engel diary, because I had by now been allowed to see it by him. I went to his office in Dusseldorf, where he was an arms dealer, and he allowed me to sit there reading through the 2 ring binders for one afternoon, and I typed up a few extracts, and I saw extracts in the Institute's card index as well. And I went back and compared it. I began typing out extracts to put in my card index, except I had problems. If they were genuine diary, then it will mesh perfectly with my card index. But I had problems with his diary, because November the 24th, 1942, for example, I think that's the date, he describes a blazing row between Hitler and Hermann Göring over the Battle of Stalingrad. Göring has promised to provide an airlift. The airlift is going wrong. The Sixth Army is trapped in Stalingrad, and things are going wrong. And there's this blazing row on November the 24th, 1942, between Hitler and Göring in East Prussia, in Hitler's wartime headquarters. Except, according to my card index on that day, Hermann Göring is in Paris on a shopping trip. I mean, this is a pretty crass example. It shows that this can't have happened the way that Engel described, or at least not on the day, he says. This is an indication that he's written it after the war then, that he's kind of remembered the episode and he's assigned a random date to it. Well, that's memoirs, that's not diary. A diary is a good source, memoirs is not a good source. Memoirs are written under the influence of the time matrix of the time the diary is being written. So it was suspect. And then I found more evidence. I mean, the Engel diary is a particularly good example. I by now obtained the private diary of the widow of General Schmundt, who was one of the 3 people killed in the bomb attempt on Hitler's life. She had provided her diary to me. You think normally the widow's diary wouldn't reveal very much, but it gives good dates, and I'm trying to build up a date framework, a matrix for what Hitler was doing. When did Hitler decide to invade Russia? When did he begin planning for it? Well, one of the things he did was he sent Schmundt and his chief engineer, Fritz Todt, out to East Prussia to look for a site for a headquarters on the Eastern Front, because he was going to need a headquarters built before he attacked Russia. So some months earlier, he sent Schmundt and Todt out there. When was that? Well, I got the widow of General Schmundt, Anneliese Todt, and she had her diary, and she writes, in the middle of August 1940, Rudy is back from his trip to East Russia. So we knew the day he came back. And then I got the diary of Fritz Todt, the famous engineer, Hitler's armaments minister, the man who built the Autobahns, which were really the birth of the interstate system we have in this country, the famous Autobahn system. Fritz Todt was the engineer who built them. And he went with Schmundt, and that too confirms it's middle of August. In the Engel diary, he writes it down as happening in October 1940. which is important. I mean, you're 2 months out, and this is an important decision Hitler's made. In fact, Hitler took the decision sometime at the end of June 1940. So I became worried about the Engel diary, and I said to the Institute, have you tested the paper? Have you tested the paper? Because, I mean, you all watch CSI Miami or CSI, and they're at present obsessed with blood and semen and things like that. Why don't they become obsessed with ink? It's not so dramatic. But if you got a fountain pen like this one, it's covered my fingers with ink, as you can see. This ink has got an iron content. Fountain pen ink has got iron in it. As soon as it writes a signature, it begins to oxidize. You get an iron oxide. And the degree of oxidation of the ink tells you how old the signature is. And a laboratory can tell you. There's a laboratory in England who can do this very easily, called Hayner and Cox. I've used them on several occasions. They will tell you how old a signature is. They will say, oh, this piece of writing is 17 years old. Or this piece of writing is over 50 years old. That's one test they can do on the ink. Another test they can do is on the paper. Modern paper is very white. It's white because it's got a fluorescent in it. It's got a lightener in it, a fluorescent chemical. If you hold this paper in a nightclub under what's called a black light, an ultraviolet light, it'll glow. It'll glow white. So if somebody gives you an Adolf Hitler document and it glows in a nightclub, then that's been written post-war. I could write I've got some sheets of genuine Adolf Hitler notepaper. Somebody gave it to me in a militaria show. His beautiful gold crest at the top and Der Führer and the rest. I could write a wonderful document on this Adolf Hitler notepaper. I could write to Heinrich Himmler, Chief of the SS, Dear Heine, Dear Heine, Dear Heine, mein lieber Heine, I have only just discovered what you have been doing behind my back in your camps. Right? I am so ashamed that I see no alternative but to take my own life. I could write a wonderful letter, except, I have to have a 1945 typewriter. A typewriter that was available in 1945, and it can't have too much mileage on it. It can't have like 40 years of mileage on it since then. It's got to be pretty, and it's got to have the SS runes on it, the lightning flashes. But even then, you're faced with the problem of signing it. You're going to have to sign it with 50 or 60-year-old ink. You're not going to get away with it. So forging documents isn't as easy as you think. And the Institute finally did carry out tests secretly without telling me on the Engel diaries, and it was all post-war paper. He'd written the diaries. Why did the Institute keep quiet about it? The Institute of History in Munich, Institut für Zeitgeschichte, Germany's leading body of historians. Well, it was a shameful reason, and they admitted it finally to the head of the military archives in Germany, who told me in confidence, and I'm telling you in confidence, and I plead with you not to tell anybody else. Right. They had to do this because they had written so many legal affidavits based on the Engel diaries. These affidavits had been used in war crimes trials against German citizens, that if they admitted the Engel diaries were fake, these affidavits would have to be withdrawn and these cases retried. So they took the coward's way out. And they accused me of being anti-Semitic and racist and smearing me like that. So that, I think, are you saying this is the end of my time? Not quite. Okay, I've got a few more minutes. Somebody used up all my time earlier. and most of my stories. Which sources can you rely on for Adolf Hitler's real... Don't rely on Mein Kampf, although Mark himself gave me a wonderful quotation from Mein Kampf, which I'm going to impart to you. I didn't believe it. I thought this is too good to be true. Back in 1924, when Mein Kampf was written, Adolf Hitler apparently wrote, because these are the words. I'm saying apparently because we don't know who actually wrote the words, but it's attributed to Adolf Hitler. He said, if the Jews should ever manage to create in Palestine this state of theirs called Israel, let me prophesy what will happen. They will not want to go there themselves, but they will stay in the host countries where they are committing their various crimes as long as they can possibly get away with it. And only then will they take refuge in that state from which it will prove impossible to extradite them. Roughly, is that correct? Yes. That was the sense of what he said. And I thought, Adolf Hitler wrote this in 1924. He calls the state Israel. He describes what will happen, and he gets it right. And I checked it, and I put it on my website now. That's the English translation. I put the original German text as well. And every time some fresh tycoon vanishes in one country and surfaces again in Israel, having thrown all the loot out of the window ahead of him, then I always put a little link to this quotation from Adolf. I don't say it approvingly. I just say, well, a funny thing, yes, somebody else said this once, that this might well be what will happen. What else can we say is a reliable source on Adolf Hitler, a true one? One of the books you should find in the bibliography. Well, Hitler's Table Talk. I haven't got any copies, unfortunately, so I'm not promoting it. But Hitler's Table Talk is a wonderful book. he would have lunch and supper, and sitting at the next table was a little civil servant, the adjutant of Martin Bormann, the feared dictator, the real dictator, domestic dictator of Germany, Martin Bormann. His adjutant was a little mouse of a man called Heinrich Heim, who I interviewed many years ago in Munich, and his job was to write the transcript of what Hitler said during his meals. Heim, when I interviewed him, he didn't look you in the eye. He looked like 11 o'clock high, and he's talking to you like this, but his eyes are looking somewhere up there. Very odd, but he described how he'd done it, and every afternoon he would go into his office, he would type up the record of what Hitler had said during the meal in the first person, and Bormann would sign every page. And Hitler, and afterwards Bormann's widow acquired the 12 ring binders containing all these transcripts, and a Swiss gentleman whom I knew, who committed suicide a few years ago, Francois Genoux, a very mysterious man, he bought all these papers from Martin Bormann and the rights. He bought all the rights to Paul Hitler stuff and a lot of stuff like that. But he bought the rights to Hitler's table talk. They were never published in German until quite recently, but the English text was published in the 1940s, 1948, 1949, by George Weidenfeld. George Weidenfeld was an Austrian Jew who was my publisher also later. He bought the rights, and Genoux said to me, "Let me tell you, Mr. Irving, how I did the deal with Mr. Weidenfeld." He came to me here in Geneva, and we struck a deal. It would be £40,000, which is a huge sum of money, about £500,000 in present-day terms, for the rights to the Hitler's table talk. And Mr. Weidenfeld said, "To whom do I make the check payable?" And I said to him, "Mr. Weidenfeld, it's 2 checks, not 1. Oh, 2 checks for you in the name of Francois Genoux." "No, Mr. Weidenfeld. 1 check in the name of Francois Genoux, and the other check for the other half in the name of Paula Hitler." Weidenfeld had to pay a huge sum of money to the sister of Adolf Hitler for the rights to publish Hitler's table talk. He swore Francois Genoux to secrecy. Francois Genoux swore me to secrecy, which is why I must swear all you to secrecy too. Right? So that this appalling story about George Weidenfeld having paid a fortune to Hitler's sister doesn't leak out. But that is a reliable source, which brings me finally to the one fake in this connection. There is another version of Hitler's table talk covering his 1945 conversations. That is fake. The man who faked it was Francois Genoux himself. He finally, after years, admitted this to me, because I was able to prove again and again that Bormann wasn't even in Berlin on the occasion of these conversations. These conversations can't have been authenticated by Heinrich Heim and Bormann. And finally, Francois Genoux said to me, "But Monsieur Irving, surely you would admit this is the kind of thing Hitler would have said." Yes, perhaps, but still not an objective source. And as an anti-Semitic, racist, nonconformist, court-designated nonconformist historian, I'm proud to be very choosy about the documents I rely on when I write my books. Thank you. What a wonderful country this is. My car, which I picked up at O'Hare Airport with 200 miles on it, in other words, brand new, now has 11,500 miles on it after 4 weeks. And it's going to have another 8,000 miles on it before I get it back to O'Hare Airport at the end of this month. Hertz are going to be very amused when they see this, I think. Yes.
I have 2 questions.
No.
I have 2 questions.
Not on.
Can you hear?
It's not working.
I have 2 questions. Can you
Yes.
hear me now? Okay. One question is, why did Hitler send the troops to Russia so late in the year? Because by the time they got there, the weather was so cold.
Yes.
And the other question is about the name of Hitler. Isn't it a really unique name? I mean, I'm just kind of wondering. It doesn't sound...
Okay, the name of Hitler is an easy one to answer. It was originally Hiedler, if you go back in his genealogy. Hiedler, and there are various other Bowdlerizations of it before that. There's no mystery over that. Why Hitler sent his troops to Russia relatively late? People like to say, in fact, they say, well, if he hadn't done his little side show in Greece in April 1941, then he would have got into Russia earlier in May, as he originally planned, and he wouldn't have ended up in a mess at the end of the year with not enough time to take Moscow. In theory, yes. In practice, no. General Guderian said under interrogation that as things turned out, the waterways and rivers along the frontier line, along the front line area, were flooded until mid-June 1941, so they couldn't have launched the attack on Russia anyway, even if they'd wanted to, in May. And as things then turned out, an unusually early winter set in, and that was Hitler's downfall. But in fact, it was also his medical problems that led to his downfall. He originally had wanted to ignore Russia, and his original strategy called for an immense encirclement movement, with one army going towards Leningrad, the other army going towards the Caucasus, and then meeting behind Moscow. He said that the only thing that will bring the Soviet Union down is depriving Stalin of his resources, his raw materials, and we taking them over, tilting the balance, and that'll bring the Soviet Union down. The General Staff preferred the old-fashioned way of a full frontal assault on the enemy capital. And Hitler, in the middle of August 1941, was suddenly laid low with an attack of dysentery, which is clearly recorded in the Morel diaries. And he was effectively debilitated for 2 weeks, unable to take any part in the war conferences, unable to stand up to the General Staff. And during those 2 weeks, the General Staff recast the whole of the strategy on the Eastern Front, pulling armies away from the north and southern flanks of this attack, which Hitler had devised, and throwing them into a frontal assault on Moscow, with the result that none of these operations succeeded before winter set in. And that was the real cause of his misfortune in 1941. Yes, another question. Yes, madam.
You just said that Mein Kampf is not that reliable. I
Yeah.
just bought it finally out of
Yes.
curiosity.
Yeah.
And so while I'm reading it, I don't know if this works,
Yeah.
but while I'm reading it, what should I look at as like with skepticism, and what part is real?
Well, let me say straight away, I've never read Mein Kampf. As soon as I learned that there were doubts about which parts Adolf Hitler had actually written, besides which it's not the period of Adolf Hitler I'm an expert on. I'm an expert on his period in office, in power. A much more important book to read is what is called Hitler's second book. And all historians are agreed on this. All serious historians are agreed on this. That Hitler's, except the ones who didn't know it existed. Hitler's second book was originally published in the 1950s by Gerhard Weinberg, who's an American historian, who's a very reliable historian. He found it in the files of the German publishing house, which were stored in what was called the old torpedo factory in Alexandria, where all the German captured records were stored. And Hitler actually wrote this book himself. And it's not as long as Mein Kampf, but it gives a very good insight into all his plans and all his intentions.
But is there anything you think of interest in Mein Kampf?
I'm sorry, you're asking somebody who's never read the book. No, I've never read the book.
What's the other book called? What's the other book called? The second book?
Hitler's second book. And you can obtain it if you go to your local Barnes & Noble. Just order it, Hitler's second book, edited by Gerhard Weinberg. I used to have copies, but I don't have any left now. So I'm not pushing it, but I've used it extensively myself because we know this is the voice of Adolf Hitler. Yes.
What's your greatest regret about the Lipstadt trial?
Obviously, we regret lots of things. If you look back over a lifespan, you can see several mistakes that one has made. Everyone here, you can look back and say, well, that's a turning I probably shouldn't have taken. But on the other hand, there are turnings where you clearly say that's a turning I fortunately did take. And in the Lipstadt trial, I had no alternative. People say, why did you do it? I had no alternative. Ever since about 1963, the Jewish organizations around the world had decided to smash me. And we know this now because we've had access to their files by court procedures. And they became increasingly determined to smash me. And the campaign against me, I mean, as you know, was deported from Canada in 1992 in handcuffs on the floor of an Air Canada plane. Every country around the world has subsequently banned me, Australia, New Zealand. They attempt to destroy my access to the archives. They attempt to destroy my access to my reading public. They do everything they can to destroy me. And they do, as we know from one of the secret documents we obtained in the Lipstadt trial, Irving is a formidable historian, and we must do everything we can to destroy his credibility. They think they've succeeded, but they haven't, of course. I had no alternative. I could see this mudslide thundering down the landscape towards me, and I had to start hammering pegs in somewhere to halt it. And we were just very unfortunate in the choice of judge we got. I think the other side possibly, they managed it in some way, that because they were obviously a very professional firm of lawyers, and they probably knew how to swing it, so they got this judge. Because I had won every interlocutory hearing. In other words, every junior court hearing in the Lipstadt trial, I won personally, single-handed. It was only the final one we lost. I don't consider the Lipstadt trial a mistake at all. I do consider it a mistake to have given evidence on behalf of Ernst Zundel in 1988. In retrospect, I wouldn't have done that, and I shouldn't have done that. And that just enraged these animals even more. Yes.
Mr. Irving, were you successful in getting on C-SPAN? I was following that, and there was a lot of these Jewish supremacists were battling against you appearing on
Yes.
C-SPAN, and I saw a link for it at the C-SPAN website that actually did air on Book TV. That's
Well,
the first
they have
question.
now. It has now been vanished off their website.
Incredible. Sir, I've been in touch with Lady Rennell, and I sent her an email recently, and I CC'd it to you, so it's probably one of the 300 emails in your inbox.
Yes.
And I can easily see now how she's such a fan of yours. I mean, this is the first time I've heard you speak, and I think more and more Americans really have to get their eyes and ears open by listening to you speak.
Well, it's a great shame they didn't show the talk I delivered in Atlanta, which C-SPAN came. They spent the whole day in a diner down in Atlanta where I always speak. C-SPAN got permission to film it from me, and I said they could come, and they spent the whole day setting up 2 cameras with all the video panels and controls and everything. And they filmed the whole talk, including the typical C-SPAN way, the people arriving, the people leaving, the interval, the question and answer session. They filmed the whole thing. And the producer afterwards said this was magnificent, and I was very restrained on what I said. And people, I think one Jewish person who was present, William Regenstein, he wrote a report on it, which I put on the website, in which he said that I delivered a very balanced talk. This is precisely what the enemy does. In fact, those of you who are interested, come to Sherman Oaks tomorrow where I'm talking, and I'm going to be talking on the Lipstadt trial and the inside story and the methods that were used on both sides. And if you ask me afterwards, I'll give you the location where it's going to be.
And sir, the final point I wanted to make is Mark and I have been in touch on this, and just the power of the Jewish neoconservatives here and their cronies, the evangelical Christians. I've been in touch with former UN Weapons Inspector Scott Ritter, and he'd actually sent me an article before it was published at Al Jazeera. And the power that these people have, he couldn't even get this op-ed published in any of the British newspapers, none of the American newspapers.
Who wrote the op-ed?
Former UN Weapons Inspector Scott Ritter.
Oh, yes. Well, Scott Ritter, of course, is barely now persona grata, because he is so frequent. You start off your life, or by halfway through your professional career, you build up a kind of bank balance of credibility and capital that you can use. And you have to use it very sparingly. You have to keep your powder dry. And he's probably used up too much of his capital recently, and people and the media are now frightened of using him. But he obviously knows what's what. He knows what's going on.
Exactly. Well, the main point he'd made in this recent article, again, anybody can find it at aljazeera.com on March 30th. He has a neocon source which has told him that the U.S. plans to attack Iran's nuclear facilities in June or shortly thereafter. Now, we're going to see the similar lead-up that we had to the Iraq War with Iran, demonization and similar, and the whole Middle East is going to explode for these Jewish
the sad
supremacist
thing is that
neoconservatives.
95% of the middle Americans don't care. I mean, as long as they get to watch Desperate Housewives, they really don't care what's happening they don't care what's happening in the Middle East. And I mean, I can give you one example of that. Yeah. Well, I can give you one example of this nonchalance of the American public. You may remember in February 2003, Colin Powell was in the Security Council of the United Nations with a big screen showing the satellite photos, the proof of the weapons of mass destruction, and he also showed 2 transcripts of Iraqi officers talking to each other. One of them saying, in effect, "Ahmed, I hope you managed to hide those weapons of mass destruction before the..." and Ahmed in the next transcript saying, "Don't worry, boss, we've hidden it somewhere where the Americans will never find them if they search for 1,000." And Colin Powell says, here's the evidence, not only that these weapons existed, but also that they, in contravention of the United Nations resolution, they are trying to hide them. Now, I said at the time in my previous talk, I said, we all know these weapons didn't exist, so what does that tell us about the authenticity of those transcripts? 3 or 4 weeks ago, the Washington Post published an article saying the NSA now admits that they have at no time managed to penetrate the Iraqi communications. Yet no newspaper says, what does that mean about what Colin Powell was saying in February 2003? I mean, either there's a disconnect, or the journalists on autopilot, and they don't want to be the first one to say the emperor's got no clothes. Well, you've had quite a few questions, and I think we're probably running out of time.
Sir, just James Bamford's book.
What?
James Bamford, the esteemed U.S. intelligence.
He's very good. James Bamford is very good.
Well, this week, quickly, just for the record, because I know Mark's taping this. He has a book out titled A Pretext for War. And that book just really lays it out with regard to the neoconservatives who duped us.
James Bamford is rather like Scott Ritter. He also wrote a book on the Liberty, USS Liberty, and
Body of Secrets, yeah.
And he's used up a lot of his available capital, and he will find himself also not being publishable in consequence.
I was just wondering, I have a 2-part question. What was Hess's mission to England or was it a planned mission?
Yeah.
And how did he actually die? Was he murdered?
Well, Rudolf Hess was almost certainly murdered. To answer your second part first, I've read the autopsy report prepared by Professor Ottmar Spann, who was the forensic pathologist at the University of Munich, who carried out the autopsy on the body of Hess after he was turned over by the British authorities to Hess's family. The British actually welded Hess's body into a steel casket, and they turned it over to the family, implying strongly they would be very grateful if the Hess family then buried it without any further ado. But instead of turning left, they turned right. The family took it down to Munich and had the casket then cut open and had the body then properly autopsied. And the autopsy in particular refers to the fact that the scar on Hess's neck, Hess was said to have hanged himself. Well, there are various medical reasons why he couldn't have. He was so old and senile that he couldn't tie his own shoelaces. He couldn't raise his arms above his shoulder level. He couldn't have tied a noose around his neck and put it over a hook, which is what the Allied version said. But quite apart from that, the scar around his neck was horizontal, whereas the scar of a hanged man is usually diagonal. And I've got, I think, links on my website to photographs showing the actual neck with the scar marks. And the pathologist said, in his opinion, it was a case of strangulation by a third party rather than suicide. The British government actually stopped the German police investigation because we had control of that sector of Berlin at that time. One more question. Yes?
I got one.
Mr. Hansen, yeah.
Did Hitler violate promises that he made in Munich? And also, why did he declare war on the United States?
That sounds like two
after
rather than
Pearl
one.
Harbor?
Which do you want to answer, the United States or Munich? The United States one is easiest because effectively the United States had declared war on Hitler already. They had shoot-on-sight orders issued to the United States warships. They were trailing their code deliberately in front of the German submarines in the hopes that the German submarines would attack the United States warships. And Hitler was constantly being pressed by the German Navy commander, Grand Admiral Raeder, to declare war on the United States so that his submarines could open fire. Hitler had ordered his submarines to take no action whatever against the United States warships unless under attack. And it was a moment that Hitler had been waiting for. He thought it was a relatively risk-free declaration of war in the United States because he thought the United States would devote most of their energy to warding off the Japanese. And he didn't realize that the United States would adopt a policy of Germany first. And that was his miscalculation. I think that Mark is now going to end the meeting. I'm very grateful for you all coming. I'm going to drive from here up to Seattle and then through North Dakota back to, as I say, to the Hertz station in O'Hare. It's going to be very interesting what they say.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you, all of you, for coming this evening. And this concludes our meeting.